There are certain English customs which, to the foreign observer, possess an almost mystical quality, traditions that seem to spring from the very soil of the countryside and embed themselves so deeply in the national character that they become as natural as breathing. The Christmas house party is surely among the most enduring of these, and it was with considerable anticipation that I found myself, on the afternoon of December 23rd, 1935, approaching the imposing gates of Mistletoe Manor in the heart of the Cotswolds. The invitation had come from Lady Constance Ashworth, a woman whose reputation for both hospitality and sharp observation preceded her into any room she entered. Her letter, penned in the precise hand that spoke of an excellent governess and unwavering self-discipline, had been both gracious and intriguing. My dear Captain Hastings, you would do me the greatest kindness by joining our small gathering for Christmas. I confess there are certain complications that have arisen, and I believe your unique experience with matters of delicacy might prove invaluable. The manor itself rose from the snow-covered landscape like something from a Gothic romance, its ancient stones mellowed by centuries of English weather to a warm honey color that seemed to glow in the pale winter sunlight. Tall windows blazed with welcoming light, and smoke curled from multiple chimneys into the crisp December air. As my motor car crunched along the gravel drive, I could see that other guests had already arrived. A collection of elegant vehicles stood arranged with military precision near the main entrance, their chrome fittings glinting despite the overcast sky. The manor and its mistress. Lady Constance greeted me in the grand hall with the kind of warmth that immediately puts a guest at ease while simultaneously conveying that one's hostess is a woman of considerable perception. At 53, she possessed that particular English beauty that improves with age. Silver hair perfectly arranged, intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing, and a manner that suggested she had been managing complex social situations since childhood. Her husband, Sir Reginald Ashworth, was a man of different temperament entirely. Robust, jovial, with the kind of hearty laugh that echoed off stone walls and the slightly flushed complexion that spoke of good living and outdoor pursuits. "Hastings, my dear fellow," Sir Reginald boomed, clasping my hand with the enthusiasm of an old friend, though we had met only once before at my club. "Delighted you could join us. Constance has been quite insistent that we needed someone with your particular, shall we say, expertise in unusual situations." The hall itself was a masterpiece of Christmas decoration, though I detected Lady Constance's refined touch in every carefully placed garland and precisely arranged candle. A magnificent tree dominated one corner, its branches heavy with ornaments that caught and reflected the light from the great fireplace. But it was the mistletoe that drew the eye, not merely the traditional sprigs hung in doorways, but an elaborate centerpiece suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Gathered from the ancient apple tree in the conservatory, Lady Constance explained, it formed a cascading arrangement of pale green leaves and white berries that seemed to shimmer in the firelight. "We have a particular tradition here at Mistletoe Manor," she said, her eyes twinkling with what I would later recognize as a mixture of amusement and apprehension. "On Christmas Eve, we gather beneath the mistletoe tree in the conservatory for our annual ceremony. It's quite charming, really, though I confess this year I find myself rather concerned about the guest list." The assembled company. As the afternoon progressed and the other guests assembled for tea, I began to understand Lady Constance's cryptic remarks about complications. The gathering was indeed small, perhaps a dozen individuals in total, but the undercurrents of tension were as palpable as the scent of pine needles and wood smoke that permeated the manor. Mr. Geoffrey Ashworth, Sir Reginald's nephew and presumed heir, was a man of 40 whose handsome features were marred by a perpetual expression of barely concealed resentment. His wife, the former Miss Diana Worthington, possessed the kind of striking beauty that photographs well but somehow never quite translates to warmth in person. She moved through the room with the calculated grace of a woman accustomed to being admired, yet I detected something almost predatory in the way her dark eyes assessed each person she encountered. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the family physician and longtime friend, presented a study in contrasts. His weathered hands spoke of decades spent in service to others, yet there was something in his manner, a careful way of choosing his words, a tendency to observe rather than participate, that suggested a man carrying the weight of professional secrets. When he looked at Sir Reginald, I caught a flicker of something that might have been concern or perhaps professional assessment. Miss Penelope Hartwell, Lady Constance's personal secretary, hovered at the periphery of conversations with the nervous energy of someone perpetually on guard. At 35, she had the kind of unremarkable appearance that made her nearly invisible in social situations, a quality that, I suspected, had made her privy to information that others believed safely hidden. Her pale eyes darted constantly between the assembled guests, and I noticed that her hands trembled slightly when she reached for her teacup. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood, newly appointed to the local parish, stood somewhat apart from the others, his youthful face bearing an expression of earnest goodwill that seemed almost incongruous among the sophisticated gathering. Yet there was something in his manner, a careful way of speaking, a tendency to deflect personal questions that suggested his clerical humility might conceal ambitions of a more worldly nature. Mr. James Morrison, Sir Reginald's solicitor and financial adviser, possessed the kind of forgettable appearance that served him well in his profession. His thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles gave him the look of a clerk, yet his sharp eyes and precise manner of speaking revealed a mind capable of navigating the most complex legal and financial arrangements. When he looked at his host, I detected something that might have been pity, or perhaps professional resignation. Undercurrents and revelations. As the evening progressed and we gathered for dinner in the oak-paneled dining room, the tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of polite conversation began to manifest in more obvious ways. Sir Reginald, perhaps emboldened by an excellent claret, made several pointed remarks about family loyalty and the importance of appreciating one's blessings while one still possessed them. His nephew Geoffrey's jaw tightened with each barbed comment, while Diana's smile became increasingly brittle. "I've been giving considerable thought to the future," Sir Reginald announced as the main course was served, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "The estate, the investments, the various arrangements that will need to be made. I believe it's time for certain changes, significant changes that will, I'm sure, come as quite a surprise to some of you." The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound, broken only by the soft clink of silver against china and the whisper of the wind against the tall windows. Lady Constance's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her wine-glass, while Dr. Whitfield's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Miss Hartwell's face had gone quite pale, and I noticed that her eyes darted quickly to Mr. Morrison, who was studying his plate with unusual intensity. "Changes, uncle." Geoffrey's voice was carefully controlled, but I detected the strain beneath his casual tone. "How interesting. I do hope you'll share the details with the family before making any final decisions." Sir Reginald's laugh was not entirely pleasant. "Oh, I think you'll find the details quite illuminating, my boy. Quite illuminating indeed. But Christmas Eve will be soon enough for revelations. After all, what could be more appropriate than sharing important news beneath the mistletoe tree? The shadow of secrets." Later that evening, as the guests dispersed to their rooms, I found myself in conversation with Lady Constance in the library. The room was warm and intimate, lined with leather-bound volumes and illuminated by the soft glow of table lamps. She stood before the fireplace, her hands clasped behind her back, staring into the flames with an expression of deep concern. "I'm afraid, Captain Hastings, that you may find our Christmas celebration rather more eventful than you anticipated," she said without turning around. "My husband has been difficult lately. He's discovered certain things about the family, about the business arrangements, about people he trusted. I fear his announcement tomorrow evening may have consequences that none of us can foresee." "What sort of consequences?" I asked gently. She turned to face me then, and in her eyes I saw not just worry, but genuine fear. "The kind that destroy families, Captain. The kind that drive people to desperate measures. I've watched this house fill with secrets over the years, and I've learned that secrets, like pressure in a steam engine, must eventually find release. I only pray that when they do, the explosion doesn't destroy everything in its path." As I made my way to my room that night, her words echoed in my mind. The manner seemed to whisper with hidden tensions, and I found myself thinking of my friend Hercule Poirot and his remarkable ability to perceive the psychological currents that drive human beings to extremes. Little did I know that before another sunset, those currents would culminate in murder most foul, and that the festive mistletoe would become the witness to a crime that would challenge even the greatest detective's powers of deduction. The stage was set. The players assembled, and the secrets that Lady Constance feared were about to demand their terrible price. In the conservatory, the ancient mistletoe tree waited, its pale berries gleaming like pearls in the moonlight, ready to preside over revelations that would transform Christmas Eve into a night of reckoning none would ever forget. Christmas Eve dawned with a crystalline stillness that seemed to hold the manor in suspended animation. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, transforming the grounds into a pristine winter tableau, yet within Mistletoe Manor itself, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged with unspoken tensions. I rose early to find the corridors already bustling with servants preparing for the evening's festivities, their movements quick and purposeful as they polished silver and arranged the elaborate floral displays that Lady Constance had planned with such meticulous care. At breakfast, the undercurrents of the previous evening's dinner conversation were even more pronounced. Sir Reginald appeared unusually brisk, consuming his morning meal with mechanical efficiency, while his eyes frequently strayed to the mantel clock. Geoffrey Ashworth sat in brooding silence, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, as if he had spent a sleepless night wrestling with troubling thoughts. His wife Diana maintained an unsettling composure, her dark eyes occasionally flicking toward her host with an expression that seemed to combine calculation with barely concealed disdain. It was during this tense morning meal that a footman approached with a telegram on a silver tray. The message was brief, but brought an immediate sense of relief. "Arriving before noon, you will forgive intrusion. The season is no respecter of troubles. H. Poirot." Lady Constance's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of mingled relief and anxiety. "I wrote to him," she confessed quietly, as if admitting to some secret transgression. "A fortnight ago, when Reginald first spoke of his plans. I wasn't certain whether Monsieur Poirot would take notice at such a time of year." True to his word, my friend arrived precisely as promised, stepping from a hired motor car with his characteristic precision and immaculate appearance intact despite the winter weather. His mustaches were splendidly waxed, his gloves the perfect shade of dove gray, and only a light dusting of snow on his bowler hat betrayed that he was subject to the same earthly conditions as the rest of us. "My dear Hastings," he exclaimed, extending his hands in greeting, "the English winter, it is a conspiracy against comfort, n'est-ce pas? And yet—" His eyes swept the grand hall with its elaborate Christmas decorations, and his expression brightened with genuine appreciation. "Madame," he said, turning to Lady Constance with a precise bow, "you possess the true sense for order. One perceives it immediately." The introductions that followed demonstrated Poirot's remarkable ability to assess character through the briefest of interactions. To Sir Reginald he spoke of old traditions and enduring obligations. To Geoffrey he offered a comment so carefully neutral that it seemed to pierce through the younger man's carefully constructed facade. And to Diana he paid a compliment so exquisitely balanced that her practiced smile faltered for just a moment. Miss Hartwell, who had been hovering nervously at the periphery with her ever-present notebook, nearly dropped her papers when Poirot inquired whether the day's schedule had been properly organized. Because a schedule, mademoiselle, is the architecture of peace. Poirot's first request was to examine the famous mistletoe tree, and Lady Constance led us immediately to the conservatory. The glass-walled room was surprisingly warm despite the bitter cold outside, heated by an elaborate system of pipes that created a tropical microclimate. The ancient apple tree stood at the center like a natural cathedral, its gnarled branches heavy with clusters of pale mistletoe, each white berry catching the filtered winter light like tiny pearls. As we stood admiring this botanical marvel, Poirot's keen eyes began their methodical examination. He noticed, as he always did, the telling details that others overlooked. A fallen berry crushed near the threshold, a faint smudge of soil on a nearby bench, a green ribbon caught on the corner of a terracotta pot, cheaper material than Lady Constance would have chosen for her careful decorations. "The mistletoe," he observed quietly to Lady Constance, "it is beautiful, but also dangerous, n'est-ce pas? The berries, they are not to be eaten, and the plant itself, it draws life from its host, while slowly weakening the very thing that sustains it. There is philosophy in this arrangement." Our contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Geoffrey Ashworth, whose face bore the grim determination of a man who had reached some desperate conclusion during the sleepless hours before dawn. When he saw us gathered around the tree, his expression darkened further. "Rather early for Christmas sentiment," he said with bitter edge, "though I suppose we're all eager to hear what Uncle Reginald has planned for his grand announcement tonight." The tension in his voice was unmistakable, and when Miss Hartwell appeared moments later, clutching a sheaf of what appeared to be financial documents, Geoffrey's eyes sharpened with predatory interest. As the secretary bent to retrieve several papers that had scattered to the floor, I caught glimpses of bank correspondence and investment records, documents that seemed to cause Geoffrey considerable satisfaction and Miss Hartwell evident distress. "Personal affairs indeed," Geoffrey murmured, his tone suggesting that he had gleaned information of considerable significance. "How thoroughly dear Aunt Constance's privacy is being protected." The day progressed with mounting tension beneath a veneer of forced festivity. During a solitary game of billiards, Geoffrey's composure finally cracked entirely. "The old man's lost his mind, Hastings," he burst out, slamming his cue down with violent emphasis. "He thinks he can change everything on a whim after all these years. This estate has always been understood to pass to me. I'm his brother's son, his closest kin. Now he speaks of significant changes. What does that mean? Some distant relative? Some charity? He's become utterly unpredictable." As evening approached and the household prepared for the promised Christmas Eve ceremony, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. The mistletoe tree, now illuminated by countless small electric lights, cast an ethereal glow through the conservatory windows. Sir Reginald surveyed his assembled guests with barely concealed satisfaction, while Lady Constance appeared increasingly strained beneath her gracious exterior. The stage was set for revelations that would transform this Christmas Eve into something far more dramatic than a simple family celebration. In the conservatory, the ancient mistletoe waited, beautiful, parasitic, and somehow ominous, ready to witness whatever truths Sir Reginald intended to unveil beneath its pale, gleaming berries. The morning after Poirot's arrival brought with it a crystalline clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the manor's elegant appointments. My friend had risen early, as was his custom, and I found him in the morning room arranging the contents of a small writing desk with his characteristic precision. The blotter sat perfectly square to the desk's edge, the inkwell aligned with mathematical exactness to a paperweight shaped like a stag, and a vase of holly had been turned so that no errant sprig disturbed its symmetry. "Ah, Hastings," he said without looking up from his adjustments, "you find me preparing to hear the stories, the versions of the truth which are, perhaps, like the berries of the mistletoe, plentiful and tempting, but poisonous if swallowed whole. The systematic approach. Poirot's method, refined through decades of observation, expressed itself in the careful orchestration of his interviews. Each suspect would be seen individually, in the controlled environment of the morning room, where his keen eyes could observe every gesture, every hesitation, every unconscious revelation that might betray the truth beneath carefully constructed facades. Lady Constance was his first subject, arriving with a punctuality that spoke of a lifetime spent managing complex social obligations. Though she maintained her gracious composure, the tightness at the corners of her eyes betrayed the strain she was enduring. Poirot's approach was characteristically gentle, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine concern. "Madame," he began, settling back in his chair with the air of a confessor, "tell me of this ceremony tonight. I would understand its ritual, its significance to your family." "It is quite harmless, really," she replied, though her fingers worried the edge of her handkerchief. "Family and close friends gather in the conservatory at 9 o'clock. Reginald stands beneath the mistletoe tree and speaks, sometimes a reminiscence, perhaps a benediction for the coming year. A toast is made. Each guest plucks a berry and makes a wish. It's old-fashioned, I know, but it has been our tradition for nearly 20 years. And tonight's announcement?" Poirot's question was delivered with such casual precision that Lady Constance's careful composure flickered for just a moment. She met his gaze steadily, but her hesitation lasted a fraction too long. "My husband insists it will be then. He has asked Mr. Morrison to bring certain documents." "Documents?" Poirot inclined his head with the air of a man merely clarifying details. "A will, perhaps?" The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. Lady Constance's hands stilled in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of carefully guarded secrets. "I am not entirely certain of the specifics, Monsieur Poirot. Reginald has been secretive about his recent legal consultations." The solicitor's reluctant revelations. When Mr. Morrison took Lady Constance's place, he brought with him the professional opacity that had served him well through 2 decades of managing the Ashworth family's affairs. He polished his wire-rimmed spectacles with methodical care, a gesture that Poirot recognized as a defensive mechanism employed by men who dealt in dangerous truths. "You have been asked to bring documents tonight," Poirot began, his tone conversational. "Which documents, monsieur?" Morrison's response was predictably guarded. "Sir Reginald is entitled to his privacy, Mr. Poirot. Professional confidentiality is not merely a courtesy, it is an obligation." "Assuredly," Poirot agreed with a slight smile, "and yet if his privacy will explode like the overheated boiler, it is as well to know where to stand when the steam escapes. A codicil, perhaps, or something more comprehensive." The solicitor's lips compressed into a thin line, and Poirot noted the slight tremor in the man's hands as he replaced his spectacles. "Sir Reginald asked me to prepare certain documents last week. The nature of those documents falls under attorney-client privilege." "But you have known Sir Reginald for many years," Poirot observed, his green eyes studying Morrison's carefully neutral expression. "You think him the man who decides and does not look back? The man who, once he has chosen a course, pursues it regardless of consequences?" After a long pause, Morrison spoke quietly, his professional mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine concern. "He is not a sentimental man, Mr. Poirot. When Sir Reginald believes he has been wronged, he does not forgive easily. Secrets and shadows." Miss Hartwell entered the morning room, clutching her ever-present notebook like a shield, her shoulders hunched with the defensive posture of someone perpetually expecting criticism. She perched on the edge of her chair, her pale eyes flickering constantly toward the door as if expecting to be summoned away at any moment. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said with particular gentleness, recognizing her nervous state. "You keep the schedules of the household, n'est-ce pas? You know who goes where, when they go, what they do." "Yes, sir. Lady Constance relies on me to coordinate the staff schedules, the social calendar, the various appointments." "The conservatory, who has access to the keys?" Her nervous hands twisted the notebook's leather binding. "Mrs. Dennison, the housekeeper, keeps the master set. I have a copy for when Lady Constance requires access for her botanical work. The gardeners also have keys for their morning duties." Poirot's attention seemed to sharpen almost imperceptibly. "And the heating system?" "It was warmer than usual today when we visited." Mr. Jules, the head gardener, adjusted the temperature to protect the orange trees from the cold snap. She replied quickly. "The conservatory's climate must be carefully maintained. It's not really my area of responsibility, Mr. Poirot." "You dropped papers in the conservatory this morning," he observed with casual precision. "Financial papers, I believe." Miss Hartwell's eyes widened with something approaching panic. "I was returning a file to Mr. Morrison. He prefers that I handle only the typing, not the content review. I'm afraid I was clumsy." "Yet Lady Constance trusts you with many confidential matters," Poirot noted. "Tell me, the green ribbon we observed caught on the terracotta pot. Was it part of Lady Constance's decorations?" "No," she replied with more certainty than she had shown about anything else. "I ordered all the decorative materials myself. We used only the finest satin ribbons. That green ribbon, it was cheap material, frayed at the edges. It came from nowhere, I recognized. The web of motives." Diana Ashworth drifted into the morning room with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to making entrances, her perfume preceding her like an announcement. She settled into the chair as if it had been designed specifically for her comfort, her dark eyes glittering with what might have been amusement. "You must find this all very provincial, Monsieur Poirot," she murmured, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had worked to eliminate any trace of humble origins. "I find, madame, that human nature is always the metropolis," Poirot replied smoothly. "Geography changes, but the heart, it remains constant in its capacity for both nobility and deception." Her perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "How philosophical. Do you have specific questions, or shall we continue with metaphysical observations?" "One question only, madame. Are you content here? Content with your life, your prospects, your arrangements?" Diana's laugh was low and silvery, but there was no warmth in it. "Content. In the Cotswolds, with an uncertain future hanging over our heads like a sword. Captain Hastings will tell you that I am above all things a realist, Monsieur Poirot. If Geoffrey is financially injured by Sir Reginald's significant changes, that affects me directly. I am not ashamed to acknowledge practical concerns. And you love your husband?" The question was delivered with such gentle precision that Diana seemed momentarily caught off guard. She inclined her head with regal composure. "In my fashion. Geoffrey has expectations about his inheritance, his position in society. I have standards about the lifestyle those expectations should provide. We suit each other when the arithmetic works in our favor." "But arithmetic," Poirot observed quietly, "can become subtraction, or even division." "Indeed it can," she returned, her smile sharp as winter sunlight on ice. The nephew's desperation. Geoffrey Ashworth arrived in a barely controlled storm of agitation, choosing to stand rather than sit, his hands clenched at his sides and a vein throbbing visibly at his temple. The careful composure he had maintained during the previous evening's dinner had completely evaporated, replaced by raw anxiety and barely suppressed rage. "If this is about my motive," he began without preamble, his voice tight with strain, "then let's dispense with subtlety. Everyone in this house knows that I expected to inherit. The estate has been in the family for generations, and I am Sir Reginald's closest male relative. Now he threatens to throw everything away: charities, hospitals, God knows what other causes. Poirot's eyebrows rose with subtle interest. You have specific knowledge of his intentions. Geoffrey's face flushed darker. I have eyes and ears, Mr. Poirot. I've seen the correspondence, overheard the telephone conversations. My uncle has been influenced by people who have their own agendas. Dr. Whitfield, for instance, he's become remarkably close to my aunt lately. When a man starts playing father to a family he doesn't own— Dr. Whitfield is your physician as well? Poirot inquired with apparent casualness. He was. I prefer Harley Street now. London doctors understand discretion. Poirot's smile was almost imperceptible. When men prefer Harley Street, it is often because Harley Street tells them what they wish to hear, rather than what they need to know. You slept well last night, monsieur? Hardly. I walked the corridors for hours. Ask anyone. The servants will have seen me. I couldn't rest, knowing what was coming. Walking can be excellent for the temper, Poirot murmured, though sometimes it walks one into more trouble than it resolves. The final preparations. As the afternoon wore on and the manor's staff began their final preparations for the evening ceremony, Poirot made his own careful observations. The conservatory had been transformed into something approaching a winter cathedral, with additional candles casting dancing shadows against the glass walls and the ancient mistletoe tree standing like a natural altar at the center of the space. The electric lights woven through its branches created pools of warm illumination that made the pale berries gleam like captured stars. Yet beneath the beauty of the scene, Poirot detected the same undercurrents of tension that had permeated the manor since his arrival. The green ribbon, still caught on the edge of the terracotta pot, despite the servants' careful cleaning, seemed to mock the perfection of Lady Constance's arrangements. It was a small disorder in a house that prized order above all else. And small disorders, as Poirot well knew, often pointed toward much larger disruptions. "The stage is set, mon ami," he murmured to me as we stood in the conservatory's doorway, watching the final touches being applied to the evening's arrangements. "All the players know their roles, all the secrets are straining against their bonds, and all the motives are sharpened to their finest edge. Tonight, beneath the mistletoe tree, we shall see whether Christmas brings peace or revelation, and whether revelation brings justice or tragedy." The ancient tree waited in its circle of light, beautiful and somehow ominous, ready to preside over whatever truths the evening would demand. In its pale berries and parasitic beauty, Poirot saw a perfect metaphor for the relationships that would soon be tested in the crucible of Sir Reginald's promised announcement. The ceremony would begin in just a few hours, and with it, the final act of a drama that had been building toward this moment for far longer than any of the participants realized. The conservatory had been transformed into something between a winter cathedral and a stage set, its glass walls reflecting the warm glow of countless candles, while the ancient mistletoe tree stood at the center like a natural altar. By 9 o'clock, the assembled guests had gathered in their designated places, forming a loose semicircle around the space where Sir Reginald would make his announcement. The air was thick with the mingled scents of hothouse flowers, pine boughs, and the subtle metallic tang of the heating pipes that kept the tropical plants thriving despite the December cold. Lady Constance moved through the gathering with the gracious efficiency of a hostess who had orchestrated countless such occasions, yet Poirot noted the barely perceptible tremor in her hands as she adjusted the placement of crystal glasses on a side table. Each guest had been provided with a small silver cup for the traditional toast, arranged with mathematical precision on a tray of polished mahogany. Sir Reginald himself stood beneath the mistletoe tree, his robust frame filling the space with an energy that seemed to vibrate with barely contained anticipation. The revelation. "My dear friends, my family," Sir Reginald began, his voice carrying the theatrical resonance of a man who relished being the center of attention. "Another year draws to its close, and with it certain misconceptions that have been allowed to flourish in the shadows of assumption and false hope. His eyes swept the assembled faces with obvious satisfaction, lingering particularly on Geoffrey, whose jaw had already begun to tighten with apprehension. Diana stood beside her husband with the poised alertness of a cat sensing danger, while Dr. Whitfield's weathered features bore an expression of professional concern that seemed to encompass more than mere social observation. "For too many years," Sir Reginald continued, his voice gaining strength and authority, "I have permitted sentiment to override judgment, allowed loyalty to be taken for granted, and failed to recognize where true devotion lies. Tonight, that changes. Mr. Morrison, if you would be so kind." The solicitor stepped forward with obvious reluctance, carrying a leather portfolio that seemed to weigh heavily in his hands. His usual professional composure appeared strained as he withdrew a document bound in legal ribbon. Not the cheap green material that had caught Poirot's attention earlier, but the traditional red tape of official proceedings. "The document before you," Sir Reginald announced with evident relish, "represents a complete revision of my testamentary intentions. Effective immediately, all previous wills and codicils are hereby revoked. The bulk of my estate, including Mistletoe Manor and its attendant properties, will pass not to my nephew Geoffrey, as has long been assumed, but to my beloved wife, Lady Constance, for the duration of her natural life." A collective intake of breath swept through the conservatory like wind through leaves. Geoffrey's face drained of color so completely that he appeared almost spectral in the candlelight, while Diana's carefully maintained composure cracked to reveal something raw and desperate beneath. Furthermore, Sir Reginald continued, clearly savoring the impact of his words, "Upon Lady Constance's eventual passing, the entire estate will be placed in trust for charitable purposes, specifically the preservation of England's botanical heritage and the advancement of horticultural science. A fitting legacy, I believe, for a property that has been blessed with such natural beauty. The toast and its consequences." Sir Reginald reached for his silver cup from the tray, raising it high in a gesture of triumph. "To new beginnings," he declared, "to justice properly served, and to the spirit of Christmas, which teaches us that the greatest gifts are those we give to future generations." The assembled guests lifted their cups with varying degrees of enthusiasm, the crystal chiming softly in the warm air. Sir Reginald brought his cup to his lips with theatrical flourish, tilting his head back to drink deeply of what appeared to be an excellent champagne. The change was immediate and terrifying. His expression of satisfaction transformed into one of confusion, then alarm as his eyes widened and his breathing became labored. The silver cup slipped from his grasp, striking the mosaic floor with a sharp metallic ring that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. Sir Reginald's hand flew to his throat, his face contorting in silent agony as he staggered backward against the mistletoe tree. "Reginald!" Lady Constance's cry pierced the air as her husband collapsed among the fallen berries and scattered ornaments, his body convulsing briefly before becoming terrifyingly still. Dr. Whitfield was beside him in an instant, his professional training overriding the shock that had frozen the other guests. His experienced hands sought a pulse that was no longer there, while his nostrils detected the faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds that clung to the spilled champagne. "He's gone," the doctor announced quietly, his voice heavy with professional finality. "Cyanide poisoning, I should think. Death would have been almost instantaneous." The immediate aftermath. Chaos erupted in the conservatory as the reality of what had occurred penetrated the shocked silence. Diana Ashworth's composure shattered completely as she sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands. Miss Hartwell began to weep silently, her notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. The Reverend Blackwood moved instinctively toward Lady Constance, offering what comfort his presence could provide. Geoffrey stood frozen in place, his eyes fixed on his uncle's lifeless form with an expression that combined horror with something that might have been relief. When Inspector Davies arrived, Summoned by a servant who had witnessed the tragedy from the doorway, his initial assessment was swift and seemingly conclusive. "Suicide, I should think," the inspector announced after a cursory examination of the scene. The shock of his own announcement, perhaps. The realization of what he'd done to his family. These dramatic gestures sometimes have unintended consequences. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the assembled guests, relief mixed with residual shock. Suicide was tragic, certainly, but it was also tidy. No murderer lurked among them. No scandal would touch the family name. The solution appeared as clear as the bitter scent that still lingered in the warm air. Poirot's intervention. But Poirot had remained motionless throughout the chaos, his green eyes taking in every detail with the methodical precision that had served him so well in countless investigations. He noted the way the spilled champagne had pooled around the fallen cup, the pattern of mistletoe berries scattered across the floor, and most particularly, the faint discoloration around the rim of Sir Reginald's cup that suggested something more than champagne had been present. "Suicide?" he murmured, his voice barely audible above the continued discussions. "But no, Inspector, I think not. A man who so clearly relished the drama of his revelation would hardly choose to exit before witnessing its full effect. And observe," he gestured delicately toward the fallen cup without touching it. "The champagne, it has been tampered with, but not by the victim himself." Moving with characteristic precision, Poirot began his preliminary examination of the scene. The green ribbon, still caught on the terracotta pot, seemed to mock the perfection of Lady Constance's arrangements. Near the base of the mistletoe tree, partially hidden among the fallen berries, lay a small glass vial, empty now, but bearing traces of the same bitter scent that clung to the spilled champagne. "No, mes amis," Poirot said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that commanded attention despite its gentle tone. "What we have witnessed tonight is not the tragedy of a man's remorse, but the culmination of a carefully planned murder. Someone in this room has used the Christmas ceremony as cover for the perfect crime, or so they believed." His eyes swept the assembled faces, noting every expression, every gesture, every telltale sign of guilt or innocence. The question now becomes not whether Sir Reginald was murdered, but by whom, and how they managed to poison his drink while surrounded by witnesses. For poison it was, mes amis, administered with precision and timing that speaks of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the evening's arrangements. The conservatory fell silent except for the soft hum of the heating system and the whisper of wind against the glass walls. In the warm glow of the candles, the mistletoe tree stood like a silent witness to murder, its pale berries gleaming like pearls in the flickering light. The Christmas Eve ceremony had indeed brought revelation, but not the kind Sir Reginald had intended. Now, beneath the ancient branches that had presided over decades of family celebrations, Hercule Poirot would begin the delicate work of unraveling a crime that had transformed holiday tradition into the perfect cover for murder most foul. The game, as they say, was afoot, and in the hothouse atmosphere of the conservatory, surrounded by suspects who each harbored secrets worth killing for, Poirot would need all his legendary skills to separate truth from deception before the murderer could claim another victim. The conservatory, which only hours before had been a stage for Sir Reginald's dramatic Christmas revelation, now bore the somber transformation that accompanies sudden death. Inspector Davies, a competent officer whose weathered features spoke of too many years dealing with the darker aspects of human nature, arrived with the first light of dawn, bringing with him the methodical machinery of official investigation. Constables moved through the glass-walled space with careful reverence, their boots crunching softly on scattered mistletoe berries as they photographed every angle of the scene. The machinery of investigation. The inspector's approach was thorough and predictable, following the established patterns that had served him well through countless domestic tragedies. He ordered the conservatory sealed, posted guards at every entrance, and began the systematic process of establishing who had been where when Sir Reginald collapsed beneath the ancient mistletoe tree. The staff were gathered in the servants' hall, the guests confined to the morning room under Lady Constance's strained supervision, and the business of collecting evidence commenced with professional efficiency. "A straightforward case of poisoning," Davies announced with the confidence of a man who had seen similar scenarios play out before. "Someone introduced cyanide into Sir Reginald's champagne during the ceremony. The question is simply which of our suspects had both the means and the opportunity to accomplish the deed." Poirot, who had been granted permission to observe the initial investigation, moved through the conservatory with his characteristic precision, noting details that the inspector's hurried assessment had overlooked. He did not touch anything. That was never his method. But his green eyes took in every nuance of the scene with the methodical intensity of a master craftsman examining a complex mechanism. The fallen silver cup lay where Sir Reginald had dropped it, its contents spilled across the mosaic floor in a pattern that spoke of sudden, violent collapse. Yet Poirot observed that the champagne had pooled in a way that suggested the cup had been twisted slightly as it fell, and the base bore a faint scratch that would have been invisible to anyone not possessed of his meticulous eye. More significantly, the tray from which the cups had been taken showed signs of disturbance. One position sat fractionally askew, as if a cup had been moved and hastily replaced. The testimony of servants. Inspector Davies's interviews with the household staff revealed the mechanics of the evening's arrangements with clockwork precision. Mr. Fowler, the butler, possessed the grave composure of a man for whom the smooth operation of formal dinners represented the highest form of professional achievement. His testimony was delivered with military exactness. "The silver cups were polished this afternoon by Thomas, the second footman, under my direct supervision," Fowler reported, his thin frame rigid with professional dignity. "They were arranged on the mahogany tray in the conservatory at precisely 7:30, as per Lady Constance's instructions. No champagne was poured until 9 o'clock, when the ceremony commenced." "And who distributed the cups to the guests?" Davies inquired, his pencil poised over his notebook. "No one distributed them, sir. The guests helped themselves from the tray. Thomas stood ready with a magnum and filled each cup as it was lifted. Sir Reginald, as was his custom, selected the cup nearest to the mistletoe tree, the position from which he traditionally delivered his Christmas address. Thomas, the pink-cheeked footman whose rugby player's build seemed incongruous with his formal livery, confirmed the essential details with the earnest precision of youth. "I poured the champagne as each guest held out their cup, sir. Sir Reginald was ready first, then Lady Constance, then the others in turn. I never poured into any cup that was already filled." But it was Thomas's next observation that caused Inspector Davies' eyes to brighten with the satisfaction of a hunter sighting his quarry. "Mr. Geoffrey did approach the tray before the ceremony began, sir. He picked up one of the cups, examined it, then set it back down. When I asked if I could assist him, he said he was checking for a dent or tarnish, didn't want Lady Constance to see an imperfect cup in her arrangement." The case against Geoffrey. The evidence against Geoffrey Ashworth assembled itself with the inexorable logic of mathematical proof. His motive was clear and overwhelming, the complete destruction of his inheritance expectations through his uncle's revised will. His behavior had been erratic and desperate, marked by sleepless nights and barely controlled rage. Multiple witnesses had observed him handling the very cups from which his uncle would drink his fatal toast. When Davies confronted him with these facts, Geoffrey's response was a mixture of indignation and barely concealed panic. "I touched one cup, because it looked tarnished," he protested, his voice tight with strain. "I didn't want Aunt Constance embarrassed by imperfect silver at her perfect ceremony." "That's hardly evidence of murder. Yet you admit to having both motive and opportunity." Davies pressed relentlessly. "You were financially ruined by your uncle's announcement. You had access to the cups, and you were seen manipulating them minutes before the fatal toast." Diana Ashworth, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure, turned to Poirot with desperate appeal. "Monsieur Poirot, surely you cannot believe Geoffrey capable of such calculated murder. In front of a dozen witnesses. He may be impulsive, but he's not a fool." Poirot's quiet dissent. Throughout the inspector's methodical construction of the case against Geoffrey, Poirot remained curiously silent, his attention focused not on the obvious evidence but on the small anomalies that troubled his orderly mind. He had spent considerable time examining the mysterious green ribbon that still clung to the terracotta pot, cheap material that had no place among Lady Constance's carefully selected decorations. He had noted the way the electric lights in the mistletoe tree had been adjusted, the slight scorch mark on a leaf where a candle had flickered too close, and the precise distribution of the spilled champagne. "Inspector," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gentle authority that commanded attention despite its softness, "you construct a compelling case based on opportunity and motive. Yet there are elements that trouble the logical mind. Consider, if Monsieur Geoffrey wished to poison his uncle's champagne, how could he ensure that Sir Reginald would select the prepared cup from among a dozen identical vessels?" Davies frowned, clearly uncomfortable with complications to his tidy theory. "Random chance, Mr. Poirot. Perhaps he prepared multiple cups, ensuring that Sir Reginald would encounter poison regardless of his choice." "But the evidence suggests only one cup was contaminated," Poirot observed with characteristic precision. "And random chance is a poor foundation for murder, particularly when the stakes are so high. A desperate man might gamble with such odds, but a calculating murderer would require certainty." The psychology of murder. Moving to the morning room's fireplace, Poirot warmed his hands with an almost meditative air, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames as he considered the psychological dimensions of the crime. "There is also the matter of timing, Inspector. Sir Reginald was a man who relished drama, who had spent considerable effort orchestrating his revelation. Such a personality does not choose to exit the stage before witnessing the full effect of his performance." He turned to face the assembled company, his gaze moving methodically from face to face, reading the subtle signs that revealed each person's inner state. The man who died last night was triumphant, vindicated, eager to see the consequences of his announcement unfold. This was not the psychology of a person contemplating suicide, but of one savoring a long-awaited victory. Dr. Whitfield, whose professional composure had been strained by the evening's events, cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "If not suicide, Mr. Poirot, then we must accept that someone in this room is a murderer. The alternative explanations become increasingly complex." "Complexity," Poirot replied with a slight smile, "is often the hallmark of truth, Doctor. Simple explanations satisfy the mind that seeks quick resolution, but they do not always satisfy the facts. And the facts in this case suggest a crime of considerable sophistication, one that used our natural assumptions about timing and opportunity to create what appeared to be the perfect alibi." The gathering storm. As Inspector Davies prepared to formally charge Geoffrey with his uncle's murder, the atmosphere in Mistletoe Manor grew thick with unresolved tensions. The obvious solution had been reached, the case apparently solved, yet Poirot's quiet observations had planted seeds of doubt that grew more troubling with each passing hour. Lady Constance moved through her duties as hostess with mechanical precision, her grief masked by the social conditioning of a lifetime, yet her eyes betrayed a fear that went beyond mere sorrow. Miss Hartwell clutched her notebook like a shield, her pale gaze darting constantly between the assembled faces, as if expecting some new revelation to shatter the fragile peace. Dr. Whitfield stood apart from the others, his weathered features bearing the weight of professional secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "The police see the storm, Hastings. Poirot murmured to me as the official investigation reached its apparent conclusion. "They see the thunder and the lightning, but the wise observer looks for the changes in air pressure, the subtle shifts in wind direction that reveal where the tempest truly began to gather." His eyes swept the morning room one final time, taking in every detail with the methodical precision that had made his reputation. This storm did not begin with Geoffrey's rage or his desperate circumstances. No, mon ami, it began much earlier, in the quiet calculations of a mind that understood how to use Christmas tradition as the perfect cover for murder most foul. The first false lead had been established, the authorities satisfied with their obvious suspect. Yet in the hothouse atmosphere of Mistletoe Manor, where secrets had been cultivated as carefully as exotic plants, Hercule Poirot knew that the truth lay hidden beneath layers of deception that would require all his legendary skills to unravel. The real murderer remained free, perhaps even now congratulating themselves on their cleverness, unaware that the greatest detective in Europe had already begun to perceive the fatal flaws in their seemingly perfect crime. The morning after Geoffrey's arrest brought an artificial calm to Mistletoe Manor, the kind of hollow peace that settles over a household when its most obvious source of disruption has been removed. Inspector Davies had departed with his prisoner and his tidy solution, leaving behind a collection of carefully maintained expressions of shock at Geoffrey's obvious guilt. Yet as I observed my friend Hercule Poirot moving through the manor's corridors with restless energy, I recognized the signs of a mind that refused to accept convenient conclusions when they failed to satisfy the demands of absolute logic. The art of psychological warfare. Rather than challenging Inspector Davies directly or making dramatic pronouncements about Geoffrey's innocence, Poirot employed the subtle psychological warfare that had served him so well in countless investigations. He understood that the true murderer, believing themselves safe behind the shield of an obvious suspect, would be watching for any sign that their deception had been detected. Therefore, his approach was oblique, almost conversational, designed to probe the psychological foundations of the crime without alerting his quarry to the true direction of his investigation. He began by requesting that Lady Constance gather everyone in the conservatory, not for formal questioning, but for what he termed a small exercise in memory. The servants withdrew to the edges of the glass-walled space like hanging ferns, present but peripheral to the main drama. The tropical air still carried the faint scent of hothouse flowers, mingled with something more sinister, the lingering echo of that fatal Christmas Eve ceremony. "You will forgive me," Poirot said with characteristic politeness, "a small exercise of memory. Each of you will stand where you stood last night. The positions, they matter greatly. You will humor an old man who fusses for order, n'est-ce pas?" As the assembled company took their places, Poirot observed with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting a crucial experiment. Geoffrey's position to the left of the mistletoe tree, Diana's feline grace as she moved to her husband's right, Mr. Morrison's habitual tendency to remain slightly back from the center of attention. Each detail was noted and filed away in those remarkable little gray cells. But it was when Poirot placed a tray of white porcelain cups, where Thomas had positioned the silver ones, that the first crack appeared in the facade of normalcy. He set the tray a fraction too far from the tree, and it was Miss Hartwell who stepped forward with obvious distress. Pardon me. Thomas placed it closer," she stammered, her pale hands fluttering nervously. Sir Reginald liked to extend his arm for the first cup without fully turning. "Just so," Poirot murmured, adjusting the tray with maddening precision. "You have an eye for small arrangements, mademoiselle. Such attention to detail is illuminating." The revelation of method. As the morning progressed, Poirot began to deploy his most devastating weapon, strategic information that undermined the very foundations of the case against Geoffrey. During a seemingly casual conversation with Mr. Morrison in the library, he extracted a crucial piece of intelligence that transformed the entire complexion of the investigation. "In law," Poirot observed with deceptive gentleness, There are these subtleties. The documents, when are they valid, eh? I'm a simple fellow. You must instruct me." Morrison, after a visible struggle with professional caution, yielded the information that would prove Geoffrey's innocence of the obvious motive. "The will was executed yesterday afternoon, Mr. Poirot, in my office, properly witnessed by myself and my clerk. Sir Reginald wished only to announce its contents last night." "Ah," Poirot said with satisfaction. "That is most interesting, because it clarifies the motive entirely. If one kills to prevent a new will, one must be certain the will is not yet valid. But if it is already valid, alors, it is another kind of motive entirely." But Poirot's most significant revelation came during afternoon tea, delivered with the conversational tone that made thunder sound like a remark about the weather. "Inspector Davies has agreed," he announced to the assembled company, "to postpone the arrest of Monsieur Geoffrey. There is new information. The poison, you see, was not in the champagne. It was on the rim of the cup." The effect was immediate and telling. Diana's hand halted mid-air with her teaspoon. Miss Hartwell's cup rattled against its saucer, and Dr. Whitfield's eyes flicked only once toward Lady Constance, who stared into the fire, as if seeking answers in the flames. "A very small quantity," Poirot continued with deadly precision, "but sufficient for the purpose. The fatal certainty was achieved by ritual, not by chance. Sir Reginald always took the first cup nearest the tree, a tradition known to those who care for the arrangements. The psychology of guilt." Through his careful conversations with each suspect, Poirot began to perceive the true architecture of the crime. His approach with Lady Constance was particularly subtle, employing botanical metaphors that resonated with her love of gardening while probing the deeper currents of her relationship with her deceased husband. Standing beneath the mistletoe tree where Sir Reginald had died, Poirot observed, "You arrange the flowers with such precision, madame. Tell me, in your botanical work, do you find that plants sometimes surprise you, that they grow in directions you did not anticipate?" "Plants follow their nature, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, her composure maintained through decades of social conditioning. "They reach toward light, they adapt to their conditions, they do whatever is necessary to survive." "Ah, but survival," Poirot continued with philosophical reflection, "sometimes requires that one plant must weaken another. The mistletoe, for instance, it draws life from its host while slowly killing the very tree that sustains it. There is a terrible beauty in such arrangements." Her hands tightened almost imperceptibly behind her back. "Nature can be cruel, certainly, but it is also efficient. Resources go where they will do the most good." With Dr. Whitfield, Poirot employed a different approach, drawing on the physician's professional knowledge while probing the emotional vulnerabilities created by his long friendship with the family. The conversation revealed Lady Constance's tragic history of miscarriages and Sir Reginald's cruel indifference to her suffering, details that painted a picture of a marriage far more complex than it appeared on the surface. "Perhaps he finally recognized her worth," Whitfield said quietly when asked about Sir Reginald's decision to leave the estate to his wife, though his tone suggested he found this explanation less than convincing. "Or perhaps," Poirot observed with delicate precision, "someone helped him recognize it. A friend, perhaps. Someone with intimate knowledge of the family's medical history. Someone who understood exactly how to present certain information in its most compelling light." The crucial witness. It was Poirot's interview with Mr. Jules, the head gardener, that provided the crucial piece of evidence that would ultimately expose the true murderer. The burly man, whose calloused hands and earthy smell spoke of a life spent in communion with the soil, had been adjusting the conservatory's heating system just before the fatal ceremony. "And you saw the tray of cups, monsieur?" Poirot inquired with sharp attention. "Aye, Mr. Poirot. Saw it plain as day, and saw young Master Geoffrey fiddling with them too. Picked one up, looked at it, put it back down. Right odd, that." But it was Jules' next observation that provided the thread Poirot had been seeking. Just before the ceremony, when I was checking the heating coil by the big fern, I saw someone else near the tray. Miss Hartwell it was, adjusting something on the tray. Frowning, she was like she'd found something out of place. This testimony directly contradicted Miss Hartwell's earlier claim that she couldn't recall the precise alignment of the cups. She had not merely observed them. She had been actively adjusting their arrangement, ensuring that the poisoned cup would be in exactly the right position for Sir Reginald's traditional selection. The web unravels. As the day drew to its close, Poirot's systematic dismantling of the obvious solution had revealed a crime of far greater sophistication than Inspector Davies had imagined. The murderer had not relied on chance or Geoffrey's convenient presence. They had orchestrated events with meticulous precision, using the very traditions of the Christmas ceremony as the mechanism for delivering death to their intended victim. The green ribbon, still caught on the terracotta pot despite the servant's careful cleaning, represented the one flaw in an otherwise perfect crime. A small discord in Lady Constance's precisely ordered world that pointed towards someone who understood that world intimately enough to manipulate it. The murderer, Hastings, Poirot murmured as we stood once again in the conservatory's doorway, watching the last light of day filter through the glass walls, is not merely a person of passion, but a person of intellect. They have played a game of chess, believing they have achieved checkmate by sacrificing Geoffrey as their pawn. But they have overlooked one crucial detail. The board itself reveals the hand that arranged the pieces. His eyes swept the space where Sir Reginald had died, taking in every detail with the methodical precision that had made his reputation. Tonight, mon ami, we shall see whether our murderer has the courage to make another move, or whether the knowledge that they are observed will drive them to reveal themselves through their very attempts at concealment. The psychological game had begun in earnest, and the stakes were nothing less than the truth. In the hothouse atmosphere of Mistletoe Manor, where secrets had been cultivated as carefully as exotic plants, the real killer was about to discover that Hercule Poirot's reputation for unraveling even the most sophisticated deceptions was entirely deserved. The mistletoe tree stood witness to more than murder. It had presided over the perfect crime's first fatal flaw, and that flaw would prove to be the thread that unraveled the entire carefully constructed web of deception. The morning after Geoffrey's arrest brought an unnatural quiet to Mistletoe Manor, the kind of hollow peace that settles over a household when its most obvious source of disruption has been removed. Yet as I observed Poirot moving through the corridors with restless energy, I recognized the signs of a mind that refused to accept convenient conclusions when they failed to satisfy the demands of absolute logic. The inspector had departed with his prisoner and his tidy solution, but the Belgian detective's green eyes held the gleam of a man who had perceived fatal flaws in what others considered a closed case. The unsettling development. It was during the subdued breakfast gathering that the first crackney, the carefully maintained facade, became visible to all. Miss Penelope Hartwell, whose nervous energy had been a constant presence since Poirot's arrival, appeared at the morning-room door with an expression that spoke of a mind pushed beyond its limits of endurance. Her usual notebook was clutched against her chest with white-knuckled intensity, and her pale eyes darted constantly between the assembled faces as if expecting some new revelation to shatter the fragile peace. "Lady Constance," she began, her voice carrying a tremor that made every head turn in her direction, there are certain matters regarding the household accounts that require immediate attention. The correspondence from London, the arrangements that Sir Reginald made before." Her voice trailed off, and she seemed to struggle with some internal conflict that left her visibly shaken. Lady Constance, who had been mechanically arranging the Morning Post with automatic precision, looked up with eyes that seemed to focus with difficulty. "Of course, Penelope. After breakfast, perhaps we might review whatever concerns you." But Miss Hartwell's response was to retreat hastily from the room, murmuring apologies and clutching her notebook as if it contained secrets too dangerous to share. Her departure left an uncomfortable silence in its wake, broken only by the soft clink of china and the whisper of turning newspaper pages. Poirot's methodical investigation. Rather than pursue the obviously distressed secretary immediately, Poirot employed his characteristic patience, understanding that direct confrontation often yields less truth than careful observation. He requested permission to examine the conservatory once more, claiming a need to verify certain details that had been troubling his methodical mind. In the glass-walled sanctuary where Sir Reginald had met his end, Poirot began what appeared to be a casual inspection, but was in reality a systematic search for the kind of minute evidence that others invariably overlooked. The servants had cleaned thoroughly, yet the ancient mistletoe tree still bore witness to the events of Christmas Eve in ways that only the most observant eye could detect. It was while examining the base of the tree, where the green ribbon remained caught on the terracotta pot, that Poirot made his crucial discovery. Kneeling with characteristic precision, he produced his magnifying glass and focused on a section of the gnarled bark that had been partially obscured by fallen berries. "Hastings, mon ami," he called softly, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who has found the missing piece of a complex puzzle. "Observe this, if you please." I knelt beside him, peering at what appeared to be ordinary tree bark. But under Poirot's guidance, I began to see what his trained eye had detected. A faint scratch in the bark, no more than a millimeter deep, running horizontally across the surface. The mark was fresh, inconsistent with the weathered appearance of the ancient wood, and positioned at exactly the height where someone might have reached to retrieve something caught in the branches. "Someone was here," Poirot murmured, his magnifying glass moving methodically across the evidence, just before the ceremony, attempting to remove something that had become entangled, and in their haste they left this mark. But it was his next discovery that provided the crucial link between the physical evidence and the identity of the person who had left it. Caught in the fibers of the green ribbon itself was a tiny fragment of material, not the rich, dark soil of the conservatory's carefully tended plants, but a lighter, chalkier earth that spoke of different origins entirely. "Kitchen garden soil," Poirot announced with quiet satisfaction. The person who struggled with this ribbon had been walking in the kitchen gardens, where the soil has a distinctive composition, and the timing of this struggle, it was precise, calculated to occur just before the ceremony, when the conservatory would be empty of witnesses. The psychological pressure. Armed with this evidence, Poirot began to apply the subtle psychological pressure that was his greatest weapon. Rather than making dramatic accusations, he employed seemingly casual observations that were designed to probe the psychological foundations of the crime without alerting his quarry to the true direction of his investigation. During afternoon tea, he remarked with apparent casualness, "It is curious, is it not, how the smallest details can illuminate the largest truths? A fragment of soil, a scratch on bark, a ribbon of inferior quality among superior decorations. Each tells its own story to those who know how to listen." The effect on the assembled company was immediate and telling. Miss Hartwell's teacup rattled against its saucer with such violence that she was forced to set it down entirely. Lady Constance's gracious composure remained intact, but I noticed that her hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat with obvious discomfort, while Mr. Morrison polished his spectacles with unnecessary vigor. "The murderer," Poirot continued with the conversational tone that made thunder sound like a remark about the weather, "understood the precise timing of the Christmas ceremony. They knew exactly where Sir Reginald would stand, which cup he would select, how the evening's arrangements would unfold. This was not the crime of a stranger or an outsider, but of someone who had intimate knowledge of the household's most cherished traditions." The secretary's flight. It was the following morning that brought the development which transformed the entire complexion of the investigation. Miss Hartwell had vanished during the night, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note that read, "I cannot bear the weight of what I know. Forgive me for my cowardice, but some secrets are too dangerous to reveal." Inspector Davies, hastily recalled to the manor, viewed this development with obvious satisfaction. A confession of sorts, wouldn't you say, Mr. Poirot? The pressure finally got to her. Perhaps she was Geoffrey's accomplice, or perhaps she acted alone, driven by some secret knowledge of Sir Reginald's business arrangements. But Poirot regarded the note with the intense scrutiny he applied to all evidence, noting not just the words but the paper, the ink, the very manner of its composition. A confession, Inspector? Or perhaps something else entirely? Observe, the handwriting shows signs of extreme distress, yes, but also haste. This was written by someone who feared discovery, but not necessarily someone who feared punishment for their own crimes. He pointed to subtle details in the note's composition, the way certain letters were formed, the pressure of the pen on paper, the slight tremor that spoke of fear rather than guilt. This is the flight of a witness, not a perpetrator. Someone who knows the truth but lacks the courage to speak it. Someone who understands that knowledge itself has become dangerous. The hidden architecture of crime. As the day progressed and the household struggled to absorb this latest development, Poirot's systematic analysis began to reveal the true architecture of the crime. The murder had not been a simple matter of poison in champagne, but a carefully orchestrated deception that used the very traditions of the Christmas ceremony as the mechanism for delivering death to its intended victim. The green ribbon, the scratch on the bark, the fragment of kitchen garden soil. Each piece of evidence pointed towards someone who had been present in the conservatory just before the ceremony, someone who had struggled briefly with something caught in the mistletoe tree, someone who had intimate knowledge of the household's routines and unlimited access to its most private spaces. The murderer, Hastings, Poirot murmured as we stood once again in the conservatory's doorway, is not merely a person of passion, but a person of method. They have orchestrated events with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony, using our natural assumptions about motive and opportunity to create what appeared to be the perfect crime. His eyes swept the space where Sir Reginald had died, taking in every detail with the methodical precision that had made his reputation. But perfection, mon ami, is an illusion. There is always one small detail, one tiny flaw that reveals the human hand behind the seemingly flawless plan. And that flaw, in this case, lies not in what was done, but in what was left behind. The evidence of a struggle to conceal evidence, the mark of haste in a crime that otherwise shows such careful planning. The stage set for revelation. As evening approached and the household prepared for what many hoped would be their final night under the shadow of suspicion, Poirot made his preparations for the systematic revelation that would expose the truth beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. Miss Hartwell's flight had removed one variable from the equation, but it had also created new pressures that would force the real murderer to reveal themselves through their very attempts at concealment. "Tomorrow, Hastings," he said with quiet satisfaction, "we shall gather all the remaining players for the final act of this drama. The murderer believes they have achieved perfect safety through Geoffrey's arrest and Miss Hartwell's convenient disappearance. But they have overlooked one crucial detail. The evidence they left behind in their moment of haste speaks more clearly than any confession." The ancient mistletoe tree stood silent, witness to more than murder. It had presided over the moment when careful planning had been betrayed by human fallibility, when the perfect crime had revealed its fatal flaw through the simple act of trying to conceal the very evidence that would ultimately expose its perpetrator. In the hothouse atmosphere of Mistletoe Manor, where secrets had been cultivated as carefully as exotic plants, the final revelation was about to bloom with the inexorable force of truth itself. The psychological game had reached its crucial phase, and the real killer was about to discover that Hercule Poirot's reputation for unraveling even the most sophisticated deceptions was entirely deserved. The stage was set for justice, and the mistletoe tree waited to witness the moment when all pretense would finally fall away, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of Christmas tradition and carefully orchestrated revenge. The illusion of calm that had settled over Mistletoe Manor after Geoffrey's arrest shattered completely at 7:30 on the morning following Miss Hartwell's disappearance. Mrs. Dennison, the housekeeper whose composure had weathered decades of household crises, appeared in the morning room doorway with her face drained to an alarming pallor, speaking in urgent, hushed tones to Lady Constance. The delicate clink of china ceased abruptly as a teacup slipped from Lady Constance's suddenly nerveless fingers, the sound of breaking porcelain seeming to echo through the sudden, terrible silence. The grim discovery. "In the potting shed," Lady Constance whispered, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind against the tall windows. "Penelope has been found." We reached the kitchen gardens within minutes, Poirot and I following Lady Constance's urgent gesture, while the others trailed behind with the reluctant steps of people approaching a scene they dreaded to witness. The winter air cut like a blade as we crossed the rear terrace, our breath forming small clouds in the crystalline morning. The potting shed stood at the edge of the espaliered wall, its small window clouded from within by the warmth of the heating system that protected the more delicate seedlings from the December cold. Jules, the head gardener, waited just outside the half-open door, his weathered cap twisted in hands that trembled despite their usual steadiness. His ruddy face had taken on the ashen quality of a man who had witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "Found her not 20 minutes past, sir," he said to Poirot, his voice rough with shock and carefully controlled emotion. "Come to fetch wire for the greenhouse repairs. Didn't touch nothing after I knew there was nothing to be done." The scene of staged death. The interior of the potting shed was warm and close, filled with the clean, earthy scent of loam and clay pots that spoke of life and growth. A cruel irony given the scene that awaited us. Overhead, lengths of twine and raffia dangled from rough-hewn beams where herbs and flowers usually dried in fragrant bundles. Today, horribly, they shared space with a loop of green ribbon from which Miss Hartwell's slight form hung motionless, her feet inches above an overturned wooden stool. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Even Poirot remained perfectly still, his green eyes taking in the scene with the methodical precision that had served him so well in countless investigations. Then he stepped forward with characteristic economy of movement, his gaze moving systematically from the ribbon to the beam, from the positioning of the body to the scattered details that would tell the true story of what had occurred in this small, warm space. "Inspector Davies must be summoned immediately," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that commanded instant obedience, "and perhaps a chair for Lady Constance when she arrives. This will be difficult for her to witness." Dr. Whitfield arrived first, his professional instincts propelling him forward until Poirot's raised hand checked his advance. The others followed in subdued procession, Lady Constance maintaining her composure through decades of social conditioning, Mr. Morrison with his solicitor's careful neutrality, the Reverend Blackwood murmuring prayers just within the doorway, and finally Diana, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth as she stared with eyes that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. Poirot's methodical analysis. When Inspector Davies arrived with his constable, he approached the scene with the grim satisfaction of a man whose theories had been vindicated by tragedy. But Poirot's examination revealed details that transformed apparent suicide into something far more sinister. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot said with gentle precision, kneeling to examine the fallen stool without disturbing its position. "The ribbon appears decorative, but it has been reinforced with florist's wire to bear the necessary weight. The wire has bitten into the beam. See these twin indentations, while the ribbon itself remains unmarked. This is not the desperate improvisation of a distraught woman, but the careful preparation of someone who understood exactly what would be required. He indicated the knot with a finger that did not quite touch the evidence. A constrictor knot, finished with a half-hitch. This is the work of hands practiced with cordage. A sailor's knot, or perhaps a gardener's when binding heavy loads. Mademoiselle Hartwell arranged flowers and tied ribbons on place cards. She did not rig such sophisticated fastenings. Jules, his cap still twisted in his nervous hands, nodded with reluctant confirmation. "That's right, sir. We use slip knots and simple hitches in the greenhouse work. That there," he gestured toward the elaborate knot, "that's for serious work, when you need something that won't give way under strain." The evidence of murder. Poirot's attention moved to Miss Hartwell's shoes. Plain black leather with low heels, practical footwear for a woman who spent her days moving efficiently through the manor's corridors. "You see, Hastings, the path outside is thawed and muddy from yesterday's brief warming, yet her soles are scarcely marked. The hem of her skirt bears only a light dusting of the dry potting soil, not the heavier clay from the kitchen garden path. She did not walk here through the mud in distress. She was brought, or she came with assistance, and carefully." His examination of the body itself, conducted with the delicacy he always showed toward the victims of violence, revealed further anomalies. Miss Hartwell's face bore none of the purple congestion typically associated with death by hanging, but rather a waxy pallor that suggested a different cause entirely. More significantly, there was a faint but distinct odor clinging to her clothing. Not the bitter almonds that had marked Sir Reginald's poisoning, but something clean and astringent that spoke of medical preparations. "The scent of carbolic," Poirot murmured, lifting a fold of her jacket toward his sensitive nostrils. "And something else, camphor perhaps, or another antiseptic compound." The hands that arranged this scene had recently handled medical supplies. The hidden evidence. From Miss Hartwell's jacket pocket, Poirot extracted a folded paper that had been creased and handled repeatedly, a torn page from a household ledger bearing columns of figures with several entries circled in pencil. At the bottom, in Miss Hartwell's careful script, was the notation, "Parochial Relief Fund, advance against spring subscription," and in the margin, a cramped query that would prove crucial. "Unreceipted, speak to R.B." But it was the discovery of a small envelope hidden beneath the lining of Miss Hartwell's jewelry box, found during the subsequent search of her room, that provided the most damaging evidence. The envelope contained a fragment of letterhead from Morrison and Associates, bearing portions of correspondence regarding significant changes to the estate's financial arrangements, with a handwritten notation in Miss Hartwell's careful script. "C knows about the transfers. R suspects nothing. Must act before New Year." The psychological impact. The revelation that Miss Hartwell had been murdered to prevent her testimony sent shockwaves through the remaining household. Diana Ashworth's carefully maintained composure finally showed cracks as she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. The Reverend Blackwood moved instinctively toward Lady Constance, offering what comfort his presence could provide, while Dr. Whitfield sat heavily on an upturned crate, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine distress. "If Miss Hartwell was killed to silence her," Diana said, her voice muffled by her hands, "then Geoffrey's arrest was exactly what the murderer wanted. A convenient scapegoat while they eliminated the one witness who could expose them." Lady Constance stood very straight, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of a wooden chair. "Two murders," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had seen her carefully ordered world collapse into chaos. "In my home, under my roof. What manner of evil have we harbored without knowing?" Poirot's strategic response. Rather than making dramatic accusations or revealing his suspicions prematurely, Poirot employed the psychological warfare that was his greatest weapon. He wrote 2 telegrams with exquisite neatness, One to Inspector Davies' superiors, suggesting that Geoffrey's formal charging be delayed pending new developments, and another whose contents he kept private, sealing it with red wax and dispatching it immediately to the village. "The murderer believes themselves safe," he explained to me as we stood once more in the conservatory, watching the pale winter light filter through the glass walls. "They have eliminated their primary witness and provided the authorities with a convenient suspect. But they have underestimated the power of physical evidence to speak when human voices are silenced." His eyes moved methodically over the space where Sir Reginald had died, taking in the green ribbon still caught on the terracotta pot, the faint scratch on the mistletoe tree's bark, the subtle signs of disturbance that only his trained eye could detect. The promise of resolution. "Tomorrow evening," Poirot announced to the assembled household with quiet authority, "we shall gather once more in this conservatory. Not for a Christmas ceremony this time, but for a different kind of revelation, one that will finally bring justice for both Sir Reginald and poor Miss Hartwell." The ancient mistletoe tree stood silent witness to his promise, its pale berries gleaming like pearls in the winter light. 2 lives had been taken beneath its parasitic branches, but the truth, like the hardy plant itself, had survived the winter of deception. The real murderer had played their hand with what they believed was perfect precision, but they had overlooked one crucial detail: Hercule Poirot's legendary ability to read the stories that physical evidence tells when human testimony fails. The stage was set for the final gathering, the moment when all pretense would fall away and the truth would emerge from the shadows where it had been so carefully hidden. In the hothouse atmosphere of Mistletoe Manor, where secrets had been cultivated as carefully as exotic plants, justice was about to bloom with the inexorable force of spring itself. The discovery of Miss Hartwell's murder had transformed Mistletoe Manor from a house shadowed by tragedy into a fortress under siege. The arrival of additional constables, their measured footsteps echoing through corridors that had once resonated with Christmas laughter, served as a grim reminder that death had claimed not one victim, but 2. The remaining guests moved through the ornate rooms with the careful deliberation of people who knew themselves to be suspects in a crime that had grown beyond their comprehension. The methodical pursuit of truth. Poirot approached the morning after Miss Hartwell's death with the systematic precision that had made his reputation. While Inspector Davies focused on the obvious implications of the secretary's flight and apparent suicide, the Belgian detective pursued a different course entirely, one that led him through the physical evidence with the methodical thoroughness of a scientist conducting a crucial experiment. His first destination was the potting shed where Miss Hartwell's body had been discovered. In the warm, earth-scented space, Poirot's keen eyes took inventory of every detail that might illuminate the true circumstances of her death. The green ribbon used in the staged hanging matched exactly the material he had observed, caught on the conservatory's terracotta pot. Cheap stuff, as Jules had confirmed, used for temporary garden work rather than Lady Constance's elegant decorations. "You see, Hastings," he murmured, examining a spool of identical ribbon on the workbench, "the murderer chose their materials from this very shed. But observe." His finger indicated the cut end of the ribbon. This was severed with garden shears, not torn in haste. Every aspect of Miss Hartwell's death was as carefully planned as Sir Reginald's. The knot itself told its own story. Jules, when questioned with Poirot's characteristic gentleness, admitted his familiarity with the constrictor knot, a gardener's technique for securing heavy loads. Yet the old man's weathered hands shook as he demonstrated the tying method, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who understood that his professional knowledge had been perverted to serve murder. The hidden arsenal. Poirot's investigation of the conservatory's locked cupboard, guided by Mrs. Dennison's reluctant admissions, revealed the source of the poison that had killed Sir Reginald. An old tin of vermin killer, forgotten from previous decades, contained enough cyanide to murder a dozen men. The tin bore the fingerprints of legitimate use, pest control in the greenhouse, but also showed signs of recent disturbance. The murderer did not purchase poison, Poirot observed to me as we stood in the glass-walled sanctuary where Sir Reginald had died. They used what was already here, what had always been here, waiting like a loaded weapon for someone with sufficient knowledge and desperation to employ it. His examination of the mahogany tray that had held the fatal cups revealed the most damning evidence yet. A faint stain on the underside, invisible unless one knew precisely where to look and at what angle to hold the lamp. The stain carried the distinctive scent of the phenolic disinfectant used throughout the manor's garden facilities. The poison was applied here, Hastings, in this very room, while the cups were being arranged for the ceremony. Someone with legitimate access, someone whose presence would arouse no suspicion, someone who understood Sir Reginald's habits well enough to ensure that he would select the prepared cup. The crucial realization. It was during a seemingly casual examination of the library's collection of family photographs that Poirot made the discovery that would unlock the entire mystery. Among the faded images of Christmas celebrations and family gatherings, one photograph captured his attention with magnetic force. Lady Constance, decades younger, tending to plants in the conservatory while a small bottle of antiseptic sat prominently on a nearby table. The bottle's distinctive shape and the caption beneath the photograph, Lady Constance in her botanical sanctuary, 1910, provided the final piece of evidence that Poirot's methodical mind had been seeking. The same antiseptic that had been detected on Miss Hartwell's clothing, the same phenolic compound that had left its trace on the mahogany tray. The murderer, Poirot murmured with quiet satisfaction, has been using this disinfectant for 25 years. It is as much a part of their routine as breathing, as natural as arranging flowers or polishing silver. And in their moment of greatest care, they left behind the one trace that reveals their identity beyond all doubt. His telegram that afternoon was brief but decisive. Release Geoffrey Ashworth immediately. The true murderer remains at liberty, but not for long. Gather all suspects tomorrow evening. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice misdirected is justice destroyed. The psychological web tightens. With his evidence complete, Poirot began the delicate work of applying psychological pressure to the true murderer. His conversations that afternoon were masterpieces of subtle interrogation, each question designed to probe the foundations of carefully constructed lies, while appearing to be nothing more than the rambling curiosity of an elderly foreign gentleman. To Lady Constance, he spoke of the burdens of maintaining perfection in an imperfect world. It must be exhausting, madame, to create such beauty, such order, year after year, to ensure that every detail meets the highest standards, that every arrangement reflects the dignity of your position. Her response revealed more than she intended. One learns, Monsieur Poirot, that perfection requires sacrifice. Sometimes the sacrifice is personal comfort, sometimes it is more significant, but the result justifies any amount of personal cost. With Dr. Whitfield, Poirot explored the ethics of professional discretion, the terrible choices faced by those who serve others while bearing the weight of dangerous knowledge. A physician sees much, does he not? The private sufferings, the hidden weaknesses, the secrets that families prefer to keep buried. The doctor's weathered face showed the strain of decades spent guarding confidences that had grown too heavy to bear. Some secrets, Mr. Poirot, are kept not to protect the guilty, but to shield the innocent from truths that would destroy them. The stage set for justice. As evening approached, Poirot made his final preparations for the gathering that would expose the truth and bring justice to both Sir Reginald and Miss Hartwell. The conservatory was restored to its former elegance, the mistletoe tree standing like a natural altar at the center of the space, its pale berries gleaming in the electric light that had witnessed so much deception and death. Tomorrow night, mon ami, Poirot said to me as we stood in the doorway of the glass-walled sanctuary. "We shall see whether our murderer has the courage to face the truth they have worked so hard to conceal. The evidence is complete, the psychological pressure applied, and the stage set for the final act of this tragic drama." His eyes swept the space where two people had died, taking in every detail with the methodical precision that had made his reputation. The murderer believes themselves safe behind the shield of misdirection and false evidence. They have eliminated their primary witness, provided the authorities with a convenient suspect, and maintained their facade of innocence through 2 days of intense scrutiny. But they have underestimated one crucial factor: the power of physical evidence to speak when human voices are silenced. The ancient mistletoe tree stood witness to his promise, its parasitic branches reaching toward the glass ceiling like gnarled fingers grasping for light. Tomorrow evening, beneath those same branches where Sir Reginald had announced his intention to secure justice through his revised will, Hercule Poirot would deliver a different kind of justice, one that would finally bring peace to the dead and resolution to the living. The hidden clue had been found. The psychological web had tightened around its intended prey, and the stage was set for the final gathering where truth would triumph over deception and justice would emerge from the shadows where it had been so carefully hidden. In the hothouse atmosphere of Mistletoe Manor, where secrets had been cultivated as carefully as exotic plants, the final harvest was about to begin. The conservatory had been transformed once more into a stage for revelation, but this time the atmosphere carried the weight of impending justice rather than festive celebration. The electric lights woven through the mistletoe tree cast steady illumination over the assembled company, each person taking their designated place with the careful deliberation of actors in a drama whose final act had been too long delayed. Inspector Davies had returned with Geoffrey Ashworth, whose release that afternoon had been accompanied by the hollow satisfaction of vindication tempered by the knowledge that his uncle's true murderer still walked free. Lady Constance maintained her gracious composure through what must have been sheer force of will, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the strain that showed in the tightness around her eyes. Dr. Whitfield stood near the doorway, his weathered features bearing the professional mask that had served him through decades of guarding family secrets. Mr. Morrison clutched his leather portfolio with nervous energy, while Diana moved through the space with the restless grace of a woman who sensed that the ground beneath her feet was about to shift dramatically. The architecture of deception. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the gentle authority that commanded absolute attention, "we gather once more beneath this ancient mistletoe tree. Beautiful, parasitic, drawing life from its host, while slowly killing the very thing that sustains it. There could be no more fitting symbol for the crimes we have witnessed, for these murders were committed by those who appeared to nurture this household, while harboring the seeds of its destruction." He moved with characteristic precision to the mahogany tray where replica cups had been arranged exactly as they had been on that fatal Christmas Eve. The first murder, that of Sir Reginald, was a crime of method and tradition. The murderer understood that their victim always selected the cup nearest to the tree, a ritual observed by this household for 20 years. They knew his habits with the intimacy that comes only from years of careful observation. His green eyes swept the assembled faces with methodical intensity. But the poison was not in the champagne as we initially believed. It was applied to the rim of the cup itself, a thin coating of cyanide dissolved in a carrier that would ensure absorption through the lips. The question became, what substance would be available? Familiar, and leave the telltale traces that I detected? Poirot produced a small glass vial, holding it delicately toward the light. The answer lay in this conservatory itself. For 25 years, the same phenolic disinfectant has been used to maintain the health of these precious plants. It leaves a distinctive scent, a faint stain on surfaces, and most importantly, it provides the perfect medium for dissolving and applying poison. The physical evidence. Speaks. Moving to the terracotta pot where the green ribbon still clung like an accusation, Poirot began to weave together the physical evidence that would expose the truth beyond all doubt. This ribbon, cheap material, completely unsuitable for Lady Constance's elegant decorations, came from the potting shed. It was used to secure a small vial among the mistletoe branches, a vial containing the prepared poison that needed to be retrieved at precisely the right moment. He indicated the faint scratch on the ancient bark with his magnifying glass. The murderer returned just before the ceremony to retrieve their implement of death, but in their haste they left this mark, fresh, inconsistent with the weathered appearance of the wood. And more damning still, they left traces of the phenolic disinfectant on the underside of the mahogany tray. From his jacket pocket, Poirot withdrew a faded photograph, its edges yellowed with age. This photograph, taken in 1910, shows Lady Constance in her beloved conservatory. Observe the small bottle visible on the table beside her, the same distinctive shape, the same phenolic disinfectant that has been her constant companion in 25 years of botanical work. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Lady Constance's sharp intake of breath and the whisper of wind against the glass wall. The first truth revealed. Lady Constance, Poirot said with infinite gentleness, "You killed your husband." Not in a moment of passion, but with the careful planning that has characterized your entire approach to life. You had endured his cruelty for decades, his casual dismissal of your miscarriages, his treatment of you as a failure, his threats to dispose of the estate that represented your life's work. Her composure remained intact, but I noticed that her hands had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. When Sir Reginald announced his intention to leave everything to charity upon your death, you realized that your careful stewardship, your decades of devotion to these gardens, would be meaningless. The estate would pass to bureaucrats who could never understand what you had created here. Poirot's voice carried no condemnation, only the sad recognition of human frailty. You prepared the poison in advance, concealing it among the mistletoe branches where no one would think to look. When the ceremony began and Sir Reginald reached for his traditional cup, you knew with absolute certainty that justice, your justice, would finally be served. Lady Constance rose with dignity intact, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to stream down her face. He was going to destroy everything, Monsieur Poirot. 25 years of work, of love, of careful cultivation. The gardens, the conservatory, the very soul of this place, all of it would have been sold or neglected. I could not allow that to happen. The second crime. Unveiled. But your crime, madame, was witnessed by someone whose conscience would not permit silence. Miss Hartwell observed your careful positioning of the cups, perhaps even glimpsed your preparation of the poison. Her integrity demanded that she speak the truth regardless of the consequences. Poirot's attention turned to Dr. Whitfield, whose professional composure had begun to crack under the weight of scrutiny. And this is where you entered the drama, Doctor. Your feelings for Lady Constance had grown far beyond professional duty over the years. When Miss Hartwell came to you with her suspicions, you saw an opportunity to protect the woman you had loved in silence for so long. The doctor's weathered hands trembled as he gripped the back of a chair. She was going to destroy Constance, he whispered, his voice hollow with decades of suppressed emotion. Penelope had put together the evidence. The ribbon, the positioning of the cups, the scratch on the bark. She was going to turn Constance over to the police. So you arranged to meet her in the potting shed, Poirot continued with inexorable logic, where you administered chloroform to render her unconscious before staging her death as suicide. The green ribbon, the constrictor knot tied with the expertise of hands that had secured countless medical dressings, all of it designed to eliminate the one witness who could expose Lady Constance's crime. The tragic irony. Dr. Whitfield looked up at Lady Constance with eyes that held a lifetime of devotion and regret. "I thought I was protecting you, Constance. I thought if Penelope was silenced and Geoffrey remained the obvious suspect, we could have had a chance at happiness." Lady Constance's response was barely audible. "Marcus, you should never have done it." Penelope was innocent, a good woman who was simply trying to do her duty. "Your protection has cost us both everything." The conservatory fell silent except for the soft hum of the heating system and the whisper of wind against the glass walls. The ancient mistletoe tree stood witness to the final act of the tragedy, its pale berries gleaming like tears in the electric light. Justice and reflection. As Inspector Davies stepped forward with handcuffs, both Lady Constance and Dr. Whitfield offered no resistance. Their confessions were complete, their spirits broken by the weight of their crimes and the terrible irony that their attempts to protect each other had ultimately destroyed them both. "Love," Poirot murmured as they were led away, "can inspire the greatest nobility and the most terrible crimes." Lady Constance killed to preserve what she loved most, while Dr. Whitfield killed to protect the woman he adored. But justice built on murder is no justice at all. It is merely revenge dressed in noble clothing. Geoffrey stood in stunned silence, finally understanding the complex web of emotions and motivations that had led to his uncle's death. Diana moved to his side, her earlier coldness replaced by something approaching compassion for the man who had nearly been destroyed by circumstances beyond his control. The final reckoning. As the conservatory emptied and the sound of footsteps faded into the winter night, Poirot and I stood alone beneath the mistletoe tree that had presided over so much deception and death. The Christmas decorations, which had served as such a cruel backdrop to murder, now seemed to shimmer with a different light, the illumination that comes when truth finally emerges from the shadows. "You see, Hastings," Poirot said quietly, adjusting a sprig of the cheap green ribbon that still clung to the terracotta pot. "Even in our attempts to create order and beauty, we cannot escape the fundamental chaos of human nature. Lady Constance arranged her gardens with mathematical precision, but she could not arrange the human heart with the same success." He paused, his green eyes reflecting the dancing lights of the mistletoe tree. "The little gray cells, they see the patterns that passion tries to conceal. But sometimes, mon ami, the truth they reveal is more tragic than the lies they expose." As we turned to leave the conservatory for the final time, Poirot made one last adjustment to the scene, aligning the replica cups with mathematical precision, ensuring that even in the aftermath of revelation, order would be maintained. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the man who had dedicated his life to bringing justice to a world that seemed determined to resist it. The mistletoe tree stood silent in our wake, its ancient branches reaching toward the glass ceiling like arms raised in benediction or surrender. The Christmas mystery was solved, but the cost had been higher than anyone could have imagined. 2 lives lost, 2 more destroyed, and a household forever changed by the revelation that the greatest dangers often come from those we trust the most. In the end, the parasitic mistletoe had indeed drawn life from its host, but the host it had slowly killed was not the ancient apple tree that supported it. It was the very concept of trust itself, withered and destroyed by the toxic combination of love, desperation, and the terrible choices that human beings make when they believe themselves beyond the reach of justice. The days following the dramatic revelations in the conservatory brought a peculiar mixture of relief and melancholy to Mistletoe Manor, as if the ancient house itself had exhaled after holding its breath through decades of carefully guarded secrets. The morning light that filtered through the tall windows seemed somehow cleaner, though it illuminated a household forever changed by the truths that had finally emerged from the shadows. The practical aftermath. Inspector Davies departed with quiet dignity, shaking Poirot's hand twice in the entrance hall with the grudging respect of a man who had learned valuable lessons about the dangers of accepting obvious solutions. "I won't pretend I enjoyed being wrong, Mr. Poirot," he admitted with rueful honesty, "but I'd sooner be corrected than condemn an innocent man. You've saved us from an appalling miscarriage of justice." The legal implications of the tragedy unfolded with inexorable logic under Mr. Morrison's careful guidance. Lady Constance and Dr. Whitfield's confessions had been complete and unequivocal, their statements corroborating every detail of Poirot's methodical reconstruction. The revised will stood legally valid, but because Lady Constance could not benefit from her crime, the law would treat her as having predeceased her husband. The life interest lapsed immediately, and the remainder, the charitable trust for horticultural advancement, took effect at once. "So it was never truly mine at all," Geoffrey observed, his voice carrying resignation rather than bitterness as he stood in the morning room where so much deception had been orchestrated. "Not even after all this. What a peculiar fool's errand I've been pursuing." Diana surprised everyone, perhaps including herself, with a gentleness that seemed to emerge from genuine understanding rather than calculated social grace. "Then we must find something that is genuinely ours," she said quietly, her hand finding his with unexpected tenderness. "An existence not borrowed from someone else's fortune or expectations. The psychological landscape, the conservatory, stripped of its festive decorations, had returned to its natural state as a sanctuary for exotic plants. Yet the absence of Christmas ornaments only served to emphasize the raw emotional forces that had transformed this place of growth and beauty into a stage for calculated murder. Poirot's final examination of the space revealed a man grappling with the complex psychology that had driven two fundamentally decent people to commit acts of horrific violence. "The qualities that made Lady Constance an exceptional gardener," he observed to me as we stood beneath the ancient mistletoe tree, "were precisely those that made her such a formidable murderer. Patience, precision, attention to detail, the understanding that timing is everything in both cultivation and crime. She applied the same meticulous care to murder that she brought to her prize-winning orchids. The cruel irony of Sir Reginald's revised will had not escaped his notice. In attempting to secure Lady Constance's future by leaving her the estate for her lifetime, he had unknowingly signed his own death warrant. He sought to honor her decades of devotion, Poirot reflected, but she interpreted his generosity as a threat. The estate would pass to charity upon her death, meaning that her life's work would ultimately be dismantled by those who could never understand its true value. In her mind, murder became not vengeance, but conservation. The supporting cast. Mrs. Denison, whose composed efficiency had weathered decades of household crises, provided perhaps the most poignant insight into the tragedy. As she supervised the packing of our belongings with automatic precision, her professional reserve cracked just enough to reveal the depth of her understanding. 25 years I've served this family, Mr. Poirot, she said quietly, her weathered hands moving with practiced economy. I watched Lady Constance pour her heart into these gardens, watched her endure Sir Reginald's casual indifference to her losses, watched her create beauty from nothing while receiving so little recognition. I cannot excuse what she did, but I understand the desperation that drove her to it. Jules, the head gardener whose calloused hands had unknowingly provided crucial testimony, came to see Poirot on our final afternoon. His cap twisted nervously in his grip, his boots cleaned beyond their usual care. I wasn't thinking straight after seeing Miss Hartwell like that, he confessed awkwardly. But I want you to know she was a good sort, quiet-like. She'd stop in the potting shed on wet days and read the seed packet labels like they were poetry. Poirot presented him with a small, practical gift, a new knife with a clean, bright blade. For once, the big man's throat worked without producing words, his gratitude expressed in the firm handshake of someone who understood that life must continue, despite tragedy. The Trustees and Future. 3 learned gentlemen from Kew and the Royal Horticultural Society arrived with a local banker to manage the estate's transition to charitable purposes. There were inventories of the conservatory, schedules of staff to be retained, and delicate matters of public announcement that would acknowledge the bequest while avoiding the sordid details of the household's tragedy. The Reverend Blackwood proved unexpectedly useful in this regard, his steady, moderate phrasing in parish notices, preserving dignity without falsehood. Lady Constance's final letter from Gloucester contained no confession, only meticulous instructions for the conservatory, the care of fragile orange trees, the proper sequence for pruning azaleas, the preferred supplier for potting compost. At the bottom, in her precise handwriting, was a final plea. I love the garden more, perhaps, than was lawful. Do not let my crime be the death of it also. Poirot's final. Reflections. As we prepared for our departure, Poirot stood one last time in the conservatory, where so much deception had been orchestrated beneath the parasitic beauty of the ancient mistletoe tree. His green eyes took in every detail with the methodical precision that had served him so well, yet his expression carried the weight of philosophical contemplation rather than professional satisfaction. "The mistletoe, Hastings," he observed, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had commanded respect throughout our investigation, "continues its parasitic existence, beautiful and deadly, drawing life from its host, while slowly killing the very thing that sustains it. It serves as a perfect metaphor for what we have witnessed here. Love that becomes possessive, devotion that turns destructive, the terrible prices we sometimes pay in pursuit of preserving what we hold most dear." He adjusted his gloves with characteristic precision, his moustaches gleaming in the filtered winter light. Lady Constance intended to preserve beauty. Dr. Whitfield intended to protect love. Even Sir Reginald intended to secure his wife's future, yet their good intentions led inexorably to tragedy. The English have a saying, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." We have seen that truth illustrated with terrible clarity. The departure. Our final morning at Mistletoe Manor brought a sky the color of pewter, with fresh snow mantling the grounds in pristine white. Geoffrey shook Poirot's hand with unexpected warmth and mine with something approaching contrition. Diana, in a gesture that surprised everyone present, pressed an envelope into the butler's palm as she passed. "For the staff," she murmured, hurrying to the motor car before anyone might witness the genuine emotion in her eyes. The Reverend Blackwood stood on the steps with Mr. Morrison, whose carefully neutral expression had softened into something approaching compassion. Jules raised a work-worn hand from the path to the kitchen gardens, while Mrs. Dennison gave me a look that conveyed simply, "The tea kettles will boil, the floors will be scrubbed, and we will endure." As our motor car carried us through the snow-covered Cotswold countryside, the familiar rhythm of travel allowed for the kind of reflection that follows the resolution of a particularly complex case. Poirot read briefly, then abandoned his book for the middle-distance contemplation that I recognized as his method of processing the deeper implications of what we had witnessed. "You believe, perhaps," he said after several miles of countryside had passed by like a watercolor in grays and whites, "that I am severe with those who act for love. Yet what were these murders, if not the very opposite of love? They were assertions that one's own will must prevail at any cost. The garden could have been saved without killing Hastings. There were trustees to be persuaded, arrangements to be made. But once one chooses murder as a solution, it ends always in the kind of disorder we have witnessed. The enduring wisdom. The little grey cells solve the puzzle and expose the truth," he continued, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "But sometimes, mon ami, the truth they reveal reminds us that the human heart is capable of both infinite love and terrible destruction, often simultaneously, often for identical reasons. To understand is not to excuse, but it does teach us to arrange our lives with greater care. As the train to London carried us past hedgerows heavy with snow, a small boy waved from a farmyard gate. Poirot, who was never above such gestures, lifted his gloved hand in return, his expression brightening with the simple pleasure of human connection unmarred by deception. "Come," he said, adjusting his tie with that satisfying precision that soothed him as few things could. "We shall have chocolate in London. It is a restorative for all tragedies, great and small. Besides," he added with the faint smile that marked his return to lighter spirits, "one cannot permit the English Christmas to be forever associated with cyanide and inferior ribbon. It would be an offense to both religion and taste." The case of Death Under the Mistletoe Tree had reached its conclusion, but its lessons would linger long after the last mistletoe berry had fallen. In the end, justice had been served, though at a cost that reminded us all of the terrible fragility of human trust and the complex motivations that drive even the most civilized among us to acts of desperate violence. The ancient mistletoe would continue its parasitic existence, beautiful and deadly, while the manor's gardens would bloom again under new stewardship, a testament to the enduring power of life to assert itself, even in the aftermath of the most carefully orchestrated destruction. As Poirot had observed with characteristic wisdom, we had aligned the cups on the tray and restored a measure of order to chaos. Yet the deeper mysteries of human nature remained as complex and dangerous as ever, requiring constant vigilance from those who would preserve both beauty and justice in an imperfect world. The morning of our departure from Mistletoe Manor dawned with the crystalline clarity that often follows winter storms, as if nature herself sought to cleanse the air of the tragic events that had unfolded beneath the ancient mistletoe tree. The conservatory stood empty now, its glass walls reflecting the pale January sunlight, while the exotic plants continued their quiet growth, indifferent to the human dramas that had played out among their carefully tended beds. The final accounting, Mrs. Dennison, whose composed efficiency had weathered decades of household crises, supervised our departure with the same methodical precision she brought to all her duties. Her weathered hands moved with practiced economy as she ensured our luggage was properly secured, yet I detected in her manner the profound relief of a woman who had witnessed justice served after years of carefully guarded secrets. "The new trustees from Kew arrived yesterday evening, Monsieur Poirot," she informed us with quiet satisfaction. "They speak most respectfully of Lady Constance's work, and they've assured me that the gardens will be maintained according to her highest standards. A memorial bed is to be planted for poor Miss Hartwell. White cyclamen beneath the conservatory's eastern window, with a small brass plaque acknowledging her faithful service." Poirot received this information with the grave attention he accorded all matters of proper order. "It is fitting, madame. The innocent deserve remembrance, while the guilty must face the consequences of their choices. Justice, like your gardens, requires both careful tending and occasional pruning of diseased growth." Geoffrey and Diana Ashworth appeared in the entrance hall as we prepared to depart, their faces bearing the particular pallor that comes from having stared into the abyss of false accusation and emerged fundamentally changed. Geoffrey, no longer burdened by the weight of expected inheritance, seemed oddly lighter despite the ordeal he had endured. "We shall be returning to London today as well," Geoffrey announced, his voice carrying a quiet determination that had been entirely absent during our first meeting. "I've accepted a position with Morrison's Recommendation, a firm that imports agricultural machinery from the continent. Diana has discovered she possesses quite a head for accounts and negotiations." Diana, whose brittle elegance had been replaced by something approaching genuine warmth, added with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since I had known her, "It appears we shall earn our supper through honest work rather than inherited privilege. There is something rather liberating about beginning again with nothing but one's own capabilities." The machinery of justice. As our motor car navigated the winding lanes of the Cotswolds, Poirot shared the information that had arrived by telegram that morning regarding the legal proceedings. Lady Constance, advised by counsel but following her own unshakable sense of honor, had entered a plea that amounted to full acknowledgement of her crimes. The court, having heard character statements that meant everything to those who made them and very little to the law, had sentenced her to penal servitude for life. Dr. Whitfield's fate had been more complex. His death sentence had been commuted to life imprisonment by the Home Secretary, in view of long public service, extenuating circumstances, and the absence of premeditation beyond the concealment of another's crime. The decision reflected both the law's recognition of his decades of medical service and society's understanding that his crime had been born of misguided devotion rather than malicious intent. "The irony is complete, Hastings," Poirot observed as the countryside rolled past our windows. "Sir Reginald's revised will, intended to honor his wife's devotion, has achieved exactly what he intended. The estate will be preserved for botanical research and public education. Yet Lady Constance, who killed to prevent this outcome, will never see the gardens she died to protect flourish under their new stewardship. The parasitic nature of destructive love." As we approached the outskirts of London, Poirot withdrew his small Morocco-bound notebook and began recording his final observations about the case. His pen moved with characteristic precision across the cream-colored pages, each word chosen with a care he brought to all his professional endeavors. "This case has disturbed the usual order of criminal investigation," he reflected, his green eyes focusing on the winter landscape that flowed past like scenes from a melancholy watercolor. "We discovered not a crime of passion or greed, but murders committed by fundamentally decent people driven to acts of horrific violence by love itself, love that had become possessive, destructive, parasitic in its very nature." He paused in his writing, his gaze growing distant with philosophical contemplation. Lady Constance loved her gardens with the intensity that should be reserved for human beings, while Dr. Whitfield loved Lady Constance with a devotion that blinded him to the demands of justice and truth. Both believed they were acting nobly, preserving what they held most dear. Yet their actions resulted in the deaths of two innocent people and the destruction of everything they sought to protect. The restoration of order. The familiar bustle of Paddington Station provided a welcome return to the honest chaos of urban life after the hothouse atmosphere of Mistletoe Manor, where every conversation had carried hidden meanings and every gesture had been weighted with suspicion. As we emerged into the crisp London air, Poirot adjusted his gloves with the precision that soothed him after difficult cases. "Come, Hastings," he said with the satisfied air of a man who had restored order to chaos. "We shall take tea at Fortnum's. It is necessary, after such a case, to restore one's faith in the simple pleasures of civilization. I've developed a particular aversion to champagne served in silver cups, and an equally strong appreciation for properly brewed tea in vessels that have never been touched by poison." The ritual of afternoon tea in elegant surroundings provided exactly the restoration that Poirot's methodical mind required. As he arranged the sugar cubes in his saucer with mathematical precision, he made his final observations about the case that had so profoundly disturbed his usual categories of criminal behavior. "The truly unsettling aspect of this investigation," he reflected, "is not that Lady Constance and Dr. Whitfield were evil people, but that they were good people who made evil choices. They loved deeply, served faithfully, and acted from motives they genuinely believed to be noble. Yet their love became like the mistletoe itself, beautiful and parasitic, drawing life from its host while slowly killing the very thing that sustained it." The enduring wisdom. As the short winter day drew to its close and the lights of London began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Poirot made his characteristic gesture of precise adjustment, this time aligning his teaspoon with mathematical exactness parallel to the edge of his saucer. "We must love with open hands, not closed fists, mon ami," he concluded with the philosophical air that marked his deepest reflections. "We must serve without seeking to control, and we must remember that the greatest act of preservation is sometimes to let go of what we cannot truly possess. The little gray cells can solve the puzzle and expose the truth, but they cannot mend the brokenness of the human heart. That requires a different sort of physician, a different sort of priest." Rising from his chair with the decisive movement that indicated a case had been properly concluded in his mind, Poirot adjusted his muffler with characteristic precision. "Still," he announced with the faint smile that marked his return to lighter spirits, "one must maintain the standards, n'est-ce pas? Even after such a sordid affair, the moustaches must be waxed, the shoes polished, and the order of the world, however briefly disturbed, must be restored. For without order, Hastings, there is only chaos. And chaos is the one thing that Hercule Poirot simply cannot abide." The final reflection. Months later, a letter arrived from the Cotswolds, written on paper that carried the faint scent of hothouse flowers. The trustees reported that the gardens were thriving under their new stewardship, that visitors came on summer Saturdays to admire Lady Constance's botanical legacy, and that the memorial bed for Miss Hartwell had been planted exactly as planned. The cyclamen bloomed white and pure beneath the conservatory's eastern window, their delicate beauty serving as a reminder that innocence, once lost, can still be honored. The letter concluded with a note from Jules, the head gardener, who had remained to tend the plants he understood better than any bureaucrat ever could. "The mistletoe tree is healthy, sir, though we've pruned it back considerable. Sometimes you have to cut away the diseased parts to save the whole." Poirot placed the letter carefully in his files, centered between two other documents with the precision that brought him such satisfaction. "You see, Hastings," he observed with quiet contentment, "in the end, one chooses what to cultivate. Order, yes, but also mercy, justice, and the wisdom to know when preservation requires the courage to let go." Thus concludes our tale of death. Under the Mistletoe Tree, where Christmas tradition became the perfect cover for murder most foul, yet where justice ultimately triumphed through the inexorable pursuit of truth. The ancient mistletoe continues its beautiful, deadly existence, but the gardens it once threatened now bloom under wiser stewardship, a testament to the enduring power of life to assert itself even in the aftermath of the most carefully orchestrated destruction. The case had taught us that love, however noble in its origins, can become the most dangerous of poisons when it seeks to possess rather than to cherish, to control rather than to nurture. Yet it had also demonstrated that truth, like the hardy plants in Lady Constance's beloved conservatory, possesses a remarkable ability to survive even the harshest winters of deception, requiring only the patient cultivation of those wise enough to tend it with both precision and compassion. In the end, Hercule Poirot had done more than solve a murder. He had restored the delicate balance between justice and mercy that makes civilized society possible. The little gray cells had triumphed once again, but their victory carried with it the sobering reminder that the human heart remains the most complex and dangerous mystery of all, one that requires constant vigilance from those who would preserve both beauty and truth in an imperfect world.